They say history turns on small hinges. One decision, one stroke of a pen, one signature. That's all it would have taken for Iran to step into a world that promised opportunity, access to global trade, relief from crushing sanctions, legitimacy on a stage that rarely applauds those who don't play by its rules. But Iran didn't sign. And that silence, intentional, deliberate, echoed louder than the world expected, because it wasn't just a missed diplomatic gesture, it was a declaration. See, most nations follow a familiar script. Pressure mounts, offers are made, and eventually, under the weight of economic despair or international isolation, they sign, they comply, they fold. But Iran didn't. It stood still. And in that stillness was a story the world either couldn't read or refused to. That signature wasn't about enrichment levels or centrifuge counts. It was about dignity, about memory, about not repeating the mistakes of the past. You have to understand, to the Western eye, Iran looked stubborn, but to the Iranian heart, it looked principled. And principle isn't something you bargain over tea and promises. It's carved from pain, from history, from the blood of men who chose death before dishonor. Iran remembered what it meant to trust and be betrayed, once by powers that overthrew its government in secret, again by those who shook hands while planning invasions. So when the pen was offered, it didn't feel like hope. It felt like a trap dressed in diplomacy. The world expected gratitude. Iran gave silence. The world expected surrender. Iran gave a stare. A calm, quiet defiance that sent ripples through every office in Washington, every hall in Brussels, every palace that's ever tried to control a country without understanding it. Because what Iran showed in that moment was something rare. The willingness to absorb pain today rather than sell the soul of tomorrow. Not many nations can do that. Not many leaders would dare to, but Iran did. And here's the thing most folks miss. This wasn't about war. This wasn't about launching missiles or stoking fires. It was about choosing not to kneel, even when the weight of the world pushed down hard. It was about saying, we remember who we are, even if no one else does. The world offered comfort in exchange for compliance. Iran chose to remain uncomfortable, but unbent. There are moments in history when a signature could have changed everything, but sometimes not signing changes even more. You have to look deeper than the headlines if you want to understand why Iran chose resistance over compliance. It's easy to label a nation as defiant when you're sitting oceans away, reading reports and watching filtered broadcasts. But when you trace Iran's story, not through politics, but through people, through generations of struggle, you begin to see something the world has often ignored. A country shaped not by conquest, but by survival. This isn't just about nuclear negotiations or sanctions. It's about identity. Iran didn't wake up one day and decide to resist. It was built in, woven into the very fabric of its existence. Go back and you'll see a nation that has watched outsiders carve borders around it, manipulate its leadership and dictate its future. In 1953, when an elected prime minister was overthrown in the shadows by foreign hands, something shifted. Trust wasn't just broken, it was buried. Iran learned the hard way that diplomacy could wear a friendly face and carry a knife just behind the smile. That kind of betrayal doesn't just vanish, it becomes part of a country's DNA, passed down like a warning, taught in silence, in stories, in wounds that never quite close. So when the world came offering deals, expecting quick nods and easy agreements, Iran stood still. Not because it didn't understand the game, but because it remembered who set the rules last time. There's a resilience in that kind of memory, a steeliness that comes from generations refusing to be erased. Every time a new administration in the West shifts its tone, every time promises are made and then retracted, Iran sees the pattern, and instead of folding, it fortifies. Not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. Most nations bend to survive. Iran learned to stand, to exist. That's a difference the world has never truly appreciated. And it's why Iran didn't reach for comfort when offered. Because comfort, when it comes from the same hands that once destabilized your home, doesn't feel like safety. It feels like submission. And for Iran, submission was never an option. It's a story the world continues to misread. They expect policy to shape principle. But in Iran, it's principle that shapes policy. The people know suffering. They've endured war, sanctions, isolation, but they've also endured with their identity intact. And in a time when many countries are quick to abandon who they are for what they need, Iran chose to hold on, even when it hurt. Because to them, survival without dignity isn't survival at all. Sanctions are supposed to break a nation from the inside out. That's the idea, isn't it? Cut off the lifelines, choke the economy, and eventually the pressure will force submission. That's the formula the world has used for decades. And in many places it's worked. But Iran wasn't like most places. When the sanctions came, when the doors closed and the world expected collapse, Iran did something unexpected. It didn't beg. It didn't bend. It went quiet. And in that silence, it adapted. There's a kind of war that doesn't use bombs or soldiers. It uses isolation, financial restrictions, trade blockades. These are the quiet weapons of modern power. And Iran was targeted with all of them. Banks frozen, oil restricted, medicine scarce. The kind of pressure designed to make the people turn against their own government. But the people didn't turn. They turned inward, toward self-reliance, toward innovation, toward each other. You see, hardship reveals character. And under the weight of sanctions, something stirred in Iran that the world didn't anticipate. A resourcefulness, a creativity. They built industries from scratch. They learned to survive without the luxury of imports. They cultivated what they had and reimagined what they didn't. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was powerful. The world thought isolation would breed desperation, but in Iran, it bred resilience. While foreign analysts predicted riots, what they got was discipline. What they got was a nation that redefined what it meant to be independent. Not just politically, but economically, culturally, psychologically. And maybe that's what unsettled the world most. That Iran didn't just survive, it grew a spine made of struggle. Because when you've learned to breathe without the oxygen the world thinks you need, you become dangerous in a different way. You stop fearing threats. You stop chasing approval. You stop playing by someone else's rules. That's what makes Iran such a complex force, not its military strength, not its alliances, but the simple, stubborn fact that it was supposed to crumble, and it didn't. It was supposed to kneel, and it stood taller. There are few things more threatening to global powers than a nation that learns to live without them. And Iran didn't just live. There was another call out for a pact with the most powerful nation on the face of the earth since 1949. That was the most troubling fact, that it was supposed to crumble, and it didn't. It was supposed to fall apart without any method of support. And yet, there are some who think it was all a convention. It evolved in defiance, quietly, relentlessly, with the kind of dignity that can't be sanctioned away. Because when the world tries to take your breath and you still find a way to breathe, you no longer belong to them. You belong to your struggle and your strength. In a world driven by transactions, where loyalty is often bought and values are traded like currency, standing on principle is a rare thing. It's costly, it's inconvenient, and it almost never makes sense to those watching from the outside. Iran didn't just refuse a deal, it refused the illusion that comfort is worth more than conviction. That decision, quiet as it may have seemed, sent a deeper message than any speech could deliver. Because when a nation chooses to suffer rather than sell its soul, the world doesn't know how to respond. It only knows how to retaliate. Iran could have followed the path most take. Sign, comply, open up, and enjoy the economic relief. But it saw something more valuable than temporary ease. It saw the danger of depending on a system that never wanted it to thrive in the first place. It recognized the strings attached to every promise, and instead of reaching for acceptance, it stood with its back straight, even as the ground beneath it cracked. There's something unshakable about a country, or a person, that chooses to live by a code. Not a code written by politicians or treaties, but something older, something deeper. Iran wasn't just making a political calculation, it was making a moral one. Right or wrong, it looked at the choices before it and chose to remain true to itself. Even if that path was harder, especially because that path was harder. The world tends to measure strength in numbers, GDP, military size, global alliances. But there's a different kind of strength that can't be measured by charts or graphs. The kind that says, I won't betray who I am, even if it costs me everything. That kind of strength doesn't make headlines, it makes history. It's easy to misunderstand a stance like that. The powerful often do. They think resistance is foolish, that it's pride or ego, but sometimes it's neither. Sometimes it's just a refusal to be defined by someone else's expectations. Iran didn't want a seat at a table where the rules were designed to keep it small. It didn't want approval from powers who had once tried to erase its voice. It wanted to exist on its own terms, not under anyone's thumb. And that unsettled people. Because when you can't be bought, you become unpredictable. When you can't be coerced, you become dangerous. Not because of aggression, but because of integrity. Because in a world where most bend for comfort, the one that doesn't becomes a mirror to everyone else's compromise. Sometimes, the greatest weapon isn't firepower, it's the refusal to trade who you are for what's easy. There's something most people miss when they try to understand Iran's defiance. They see strategy, they see politics, they see pride, but what they often fail to see is the deeper layer. the one that isn't written in policy papers or broadcasted in press conferences. What lies beneath Iran's resistance is something rooted not just in history, but in faith, in identity, in a worldview shaped by something greater than power. You can't separate Iran's decisions from its spiritual foundation. To many in the West, that concept is foreign, uncomfortable even. We're used to separating belief from policy, religion from leadership, but Iran doesn't operate on that division. For them, belief is not background noise. It's the compass. It's what gives suffering purpose, what gives decisions weight. And when you see the world through that lens, the choices start to make more sense. This isn't about fanaticism. It's about meaning. It's about believing that life isn't just about survival or success, but about legacy, about submission, not to other nations, but to a higher calling. That belief doesn't get shaken by sanctions. It doesn't crumble under isolation. In fact, it often gets stronger in hardship. Because hardship, in that mindset, isn't failure. It's refinement. That's something the world powers never really calculated for. They thought pressure would wear Iran down, that the economy would break its back. But what they didn't realize was that Iran wasn't drawing strength from worldly measures. It was drawing from a well that isn't visible to outsiders, the kind of strength that comes from faith, quiet, unwavering, and rooted in the belief that this life is temporary, but honor lasts forever. When you believe that your struggle is seen by something greater than man, you can endure things most people run from. You can suffer without losing your soul. You can resist when the logical choice is surrender. Iran's identity is inseparable from this worldview. It sees itself not just as a country, but as a symbol, a guardian of something sacred. And that makes it harder to intimidate. Because when the fight is seen as spiritual, the stakes rise beyond trade or treaties. The world tried to negotiate with Iran on terms it understood: economic benefits, global legitimacy, access to markets. But Iran responded from a place the world couldn't reach, a place where patience is a virtue, and resistance becomes a form of worship. And when you approach life like that, no amount of pressure feels permanent. What unnerves people about that kind of conviction is that you can't buy it and you can't bomb it. You can't debate it away or threaten it into silence. It stands like a mountain, weathered, scarred, but unmoved. Because when faith shapes your fight, your endurance becomes eternal. The world often believes it understands what every nation wants. It assumes that prosperity, recognition, and a seat at the global table are enough to make any country change course. But that assumption only works when you're dealing with a nation that sees the world the same way. Iran never did, and that's where the misunderstanding began, and still persists. The offers on the table were calculated, measured, and presented as lifelines, relief from sanctions, access to global markets, the promise of being welcomed into the fold. But Iran didn't reach for them. Not because it couldn't see the value, but because it saw something more important. It wasn't trying to be accepted by a world that never saw it as equal. It wasn't begging for approval from powers that spent decades trying to shape it, tame it, or erase its voice. Iran wasn't playing that game. It was writing its own rules. What the world failed to grasp was that Iran wasn't driven by desperation. It was driven by dignity. And that makes all the difference. When a nation places its identity above its comfort, its values above its validation, it becomes immune to the usual levers of control. You can't bribe dignity. You can't sanction away soul. That's what confounded foreign leaders. They thought silence meant hesitation. They thought Iran's restraint was a bargaining chip. But silence can be strategic. It can be powerful. And sometimes it speaks louder than any protest or declaration ever could. Iran's silence was not submission. It was defiance with discipline. It was a statement without sound. Many believed Iran would eventually come around, that the pressure would break through, that time would wear down its resolve. But what they didn't see is that every missed handshake, every rejected deal, every moment of restraint was calculated. It was intentional, because Iran wasn't just responding to the world, it was watching it. And every time it was misunderstood, it became more certain of the path it had chosen. Iran wasn't looking for comfort, it was seeking clarity. And clarity comes not from reacting to pressure, but from knowing exactly who you are when no one else does. The conflict for more than 200 years has been the continuous pressure from no one exactly who you are when no one else. The world looked at Iran and saw a country standing alone. Iran looked at itself and saw a nation standing tall. And maybe that's the most powerful truth of all, that Iran didn't reject the world because it was afraid. It challenged the world because it wasn't.